Hey guys, welcome to our first set of notes for chapter 45, Community Ecology. It's a fun chapter. It's also a pretty easy chapter. I think you guys are going to be familiar with a lot of this stuff, so we're not going to waste a whole lot of time. We're just going to clip through it. We're going to go through 4 sections today, and the sections in this chapter happen to be very short. Oftentimes, they're like 1 page, so that's not nearly as ambitious as it sounds. So, the story to introduce you to community ecology in the beginning of your chapter is about red fire ants, Solenopsis invicta. Invicta is actually from the Latin word invincible, and so these guys are pretty tough little fellows. They're native to South America, and they arrived in the southeastern United States, probably in the 30s, and we really don't think anyone brought them in as pets. They were probably stowaways on a cargo ship, maybe some food or something coming in, had the ants in it, and once they established themselves, they pretty much spread all the way across the South. They were accidentally transported to California and New Mexico, and more recently, they have successfully made it to the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, and some Asian countries even. So I don't want to say the world, but very nearly the world. The deal with fire ants is they're just one example of a much wider problem, which is we are quickly dispersing pest species, and that's just a consequence of a global trade. We live in a much more global community than we used to. It used to be very difficult to get plants and animals all the way across the ocean, but as shipping vessels have become faster, as airplanes have been able to carry more cargo and go to locations faster, the odds of an animal making it there alive is increased. And so fire ants are a great example of this because they're not native; they're an exotic species, and to our knowledge, they're primarily harmful. They're very aggressive. They attack other native ants and kill other native ants. And when the ants are dead, uh, the species that normally prey on those native ants are affected. So from the insect community point of view, they're incredibly detrimental. They also eat quail eggs and vireos, which are songbirds. They'll eat their eggs, and they're so aggressive they'll actually eat a baby bird. They'll eat a chick. And there's all sorts of ground nesting bees in Texas and Florida, and the fire ants will take over ground nesting bee colonies and kill all the bees. And those ground nesting bees, not surprisingly, are pollinators for many, many, many flowers that those ants are not pollinators for. So the ants can really essentially destroy a community because they're an introduced species that doesn't belong there and they're damaging biodiversity. And that's just the ants. This happens with mussels, this happens with plants, this happens with uh, mammals, this happens with all sorts of different animals that are introduced to populations or areas where we've never had them. Here's fire ants on a quail egg, and they've chewed a hole in, and now the whole group is going to eat the egg, and that chick will die. Um, Quails, upland game birds, they're in special danger because they don't nest in trees; they nest on the ground. So if an ant can find the egg, then they're in bad shape. This is a heron chick that was found just covered in red ants, and they had killed and eaten a pretty good portion of that chick. So, what factors shape a community? Obviously, an invasive species can, but that's not the only thing. There's lots of things going on in a community, right? Well, a community is different than a population. Last chapter was a population. That's a group, a species, a group that can interbreed. A community is all the different species that live pretty much in the same area and may or may not interact. Um, they can interact and coexist. Sometimes they can live inside of each other. Some examples of communities existing in other communities is termites actually digest wood because of the microbes in their gut, little protists. And so there's microbes, a whole community of different microbes in a termite gut. So one termite abdomen is its own community. And then a termite is one species or one individual of many different species that, live on a fallen log. So that fallen log, because it contains many different species all interacting, is a community. And then the forest in which that fallen log exists is another community. So communities can be very small or they can be very, very, very large. And not a tricky term at all. Habitat is the environment in which a species lives, and the habitat is where communities are built. And so there's a couple things to think about when we look at species diversity as an indicator of community. There's species richness. Species richness is the number of species. This used to be called biodiversity. It probably still is, but in your book they're calling it species richness, which is fine. And then there's species evenness, which is the relative abundance of each. So, for example, having good species evenness is a good thing. Lots of different grass species and abundant different grass species. That's a healthy thing. If you have, species richness, like, well, there's lots of different grass species, but they're not very even. My entire lot of land is all smooth brome, and I have very, very, very little big blue stem and very, very, very little blue stem. And that's not such a good thing. Like, I have lots of fire ants and very few quail. That species evenness is an indicator of the health as well. So here's a little map. This is reptile species richness. And the red is an area with the most reptile species richness, the number of species, and the blue is the area of fewest reptile species richness. And so it kind of gives you an idea that as you move south through the United States, which is probably not that surprising, the species richness of reptiles is increasing. So there's lots of characteristics of a community. Obviously, the species that live there are part of it because they change the environment in big ways, and the number of species and their distribution can change over time, or it can change really, really fast. And one of the reasons it can change so fast is there are abiotic factors. Abiotic is a without, bio, life, so they're non-biological factors that affect community structure. It's not just, ants eating birds or predators eating prey, or, it's other things like how much rainfall a community gets, if it's a sunny side of the hill or a shady side of the hill. You can see that just in the Black Hills. Just look for ferns, the temperature of an area, its climate can shift a little bit from year to year, and that can affect the species that are being successful there. Natural disasters are abiotic. This is a picture of a pretty reasonably sized mudslide, and you can imagine if you were, a grass or a flower, or perhaps a little frog, that mudslide is going to be pretty much detrimental across the board to everybody who's there, except for perhaps this tree. He might survive it, but everybody else is not. So species interact, of course, and the way species interact shapes your community. These you might already be familiar with. Let's start with this one actually down here. Symbiosis just means to live together. That's it. So two species have a close association with each other. Normally when you have a close association that you're maintaining, it should benefit at least one of you. Otherwise you wouldn't maintain the relationship. So one example of that is commensalism. Commensalism is one species is benefiting, the other species is unaffected. They don't even know they're there. Good, bad, otherwise, whatever. There's a bird called a cattle egret. It spends its day walking behind cattle. The cow step in the grass, the bugs jump away, the bird eats the bugs, the cow doesn't even know he's there. The cow doesn't care. That's commensalism. This is an orchid. Orchids are epiphytes. An epiphyte is a plant that grows on another plant without parasitizing it or harming it. And so the orchid's trying to reach a little sunlight, so he grows up another tree. He's not harming the tree. The orchid benefits. The tree trunk he's climbing doesn't even know he's there. He's not harmed. So this is a great example of commensalism. It also makes growing orchids commercially rather tricky. They're a tough plant to keep alive because they live in incredibly delicate habitats, and sometimes people and Safeway have a difficult time growing very many of them, but that's orchids. So the next one is probably the most logical type of symbiosis if you had to pick. It's called mutualism. Mutualism is benefiting both participants, so think of it like it's a win-win. Flowering plants and pollinators is an easy one. The plant that makes the flower is getting the pollinator to carry its pollen and getting sexual reproduction and genetic diversity. The pollinator is getting nectar to eat, win-win. Photosynthetic organisms oftentimes have mutualistic relationships with non-photosynthetic partners by supplying sugars to them. There's some fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, and they live with plant roots. Mycorrhizal fungi are good at absorbing phosphorus, so they can help absorb nutrients for the plant, and the plant provides them with a little bit of sugar, a safe place to live. We found that plants grow much faster, much healthier when they have mycorrhizal fungi, and that's a win-win. Fungus gets food, safe place. Plant gets nutrients that are normally a real pain to try to absorb. It's a win-win. Cool. Plants luring pollinators with nectar. Plants making sugary fruits so that an animal will eat the fruit and poop out the seed later. So the plant gets dispersed, animal gets fed. Win-win. We like mutualism. This is exclusive mutualism. This is mutualism that has had so much time and has developed so far that for yuccas and for populations of yuccas, they are pollinated by only one type of moth. Only one. Only one species of moth will pollinate an entire population of yuccas. So it's a very delicate relationship. The moth comes in, gets a little bit of nectar from the yucca plant, which is fine. It takes that yucca pollen, flies to another yucca plant, gets that yucca pollen on the stigma of the other yucca plant, and then now that it has a full belly, it continues to lay its moth larvae, or eggs rather, in the ovary of the yucca plant. As the eggs mature into larvae, they eat the developing yucca seeds, and then they fly away as adults, but they don't eat all of them. The ones that they don't eat, the seeds kind of become dried out, and they crack open and they drop the new yucca seeds for next year. But if you were to, I don't know, spray this whole hillside with an insecticide because you were tired of mosquitoes perhaps, and you were to kill these moths because they were also affected by the insecticide, your yuccas, the entire population of yuccas would be sterile. They wouldn't be able to reproduce because they are completely dependent on one species of moth. It's a very, very delicate relationship, and it helps us understand a little bit better what's going on in the world. Here's another cool example of commensalism. This is a pink anemone fish. This is an anemone. The anemone's tentacles can sting a little bit. He's surrounded by a mucus that does not allow the anemone to sting him. So he gets a safe environment that most fish are not going to want to be in. So he's safe from predators relatively. As a reward, he will also chase off other fish from his habitat, and many of those fish are actually able to bite anemone tentacles off and eat them. And so he protects the anemone protects him. Win-win mutualism. Now, there are costs and benefits of mutualism, of course. Mutualism, one way to think about it if you want to be kind of a selfish jerk, is it's really reciprocal exploitation. it's not you help me and I help you. It's I get what I want from you. You get what you want from me. It's the same thing. It's just thinking more selfishly. Taking part in mutualism has a cost, right? It costs the moth energy to fly to the yucca. It costs the yucca brand new yucca seeds when those moth larvae eat some of the seeds. So it has a cost. So selection should favor individuals who minimize the cost or minimize the resource that their neighbor is taking from them. So one example of this is nectar production in flowers. Nectar production is costly. It's sugars that you're putting out to the world. Almost what would seem as wasteful. You just put the sugar out there and let whoever wants to eat it, eat it. And to my knowledge, plants are not in the business of charity. So the flowers who are going to be most successful are flowers who produce enough nectar, just enough to bring in a pollinator, but not so much abundant nectar that they're wasting a bunch. And so we want to just put out enough to get what we want, which is that pollinator to move our pollen. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I might argue that the plants who put out way too much nectar might just become bird pollinated flowers, but you know, I won't argue with it. So that is 3 sections, and we will stop there. So Thanks for your time.